Yeah, I've got,
I can use my
I think I
phone.
have one in the thing. Okay, so,
There's all these Bibles too.
yeah, if
Oh,
you
those
want to
are
read,
Bibles,
if you want to read the New International Reader's Version. They're children's Bibles.
Yeah, all right.
I love children's Bibles I love children's stories that have stories about rape and
Sodomy.
sodomy,
Oh, yeah.
all
yeah,
kinds of,
yeah,
you know,
you're talking about the
wonderful.
Bible. Yeah.
Yeah. Because every child should be reading the
Yeah.
Bible
Oh,
in a,
gosh.
in a way, in the language that they can totally understand exactly what's going on.
Right. I sense a little sarcasm.
Oh, I'm not sarcastic. Okay, so in your Bibles, though, turn to Matthew chapter 5, because we're still in Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5.
This is not going to strike him down.
Yeah, no lightning of my lies. Because we're in a basement. I want to kill the children who are above us.
You're protected.
Yeah.
That's why he feels so confident. Just saying that stuff.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so Matthew chapter 5, and we are at verse, where is it? There it is, 23. We're going to start at verse 23. And let me see here. Is that the one? No. Nope, not that one. Not that one either. No, there it is. Okay. All right, so let me talk a little bit about last week, so that way we know the context. Okay, so biggest context. We are in the Sermon on the Mount, and the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus giving the new constitution to his new kingdom, just like Moses did when he gave the 10 Commandments, or God did when he gave the 10 Commandments. This is Jesus' version of that same. That's bigger context. Okay, then after that, the section that we are in is the section that talks about mercy, and what it means to have mercy. And then the section that we're specifically talking about under mercy is we're talking about how we interpret the law so that we are living in mercy. So you can't just interpret the law any old way to be in mercy. There's a particular way, and Jesus is showing us how to interpret the law to be merciful. So last week Jesus was talking about do not murder. And he said, now if we're going to interpret that in a way that's going to be merciful, it's not just about murder, and not just about violence, even though in the Old Testament, all the interpretations of do not murder have to do with violence. He says it's not just about violent action, but also about violent words, verbal abuse, threats, and things that tear down people, using language that is going to lead to violence. All of that is included under the general heading of violence. And so Jesus was saying, if you use that verbal kind of violence, you are going to be punished on the same level as if you did the physical kind of violence. So if you murder someone, then you're going to be judged for it. You're going to be judged on earth and in heaven. And Jesus says, if you're going to do verbal abuse, or you're going to start a fight that ends up in murder, then you're going to be judged for that on an equal level as if you were doing physical violence. Okay, that's what Jesus talked about last week. Now, the problem is that if you leave it to that, then you're going, oh, well, I've certainly abused my language. I've certainly misused language and hurt people very badly with my language in the past. So does that mean that I'm just judged? Does that mean that there's nothing I can do? So in this passage, Jesus is saying, well, no, there is something you can do. So let's talk about that before we move on to the rest of the law. Okay, so let's go ahead, and if somebody could read Matthew chapter 5, verses 23 to 26. Is there anybody who wants to weigh in? Go ahead.
Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you're still with him on the way, or he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Was I doing 26?
Yes.
Yeah, I would tell you the truth. You will not get out until you have paid the last penny.
Okay. All right. So Jesus is telling two stories. Some people think of them as parables. I don't think of them so much as parables as examples, but they are two stories for sure. So the first one, and they're both kind of saying the same thing. Okay. So first story is there's a guy and he's going to the altar. That means he's offering a sacrifice. So he's offering a sacrifice. It could be any number of sacrifices. We don't know which kind it is. He could be offering a sacrifice because he had a baby born and a baby son born. You have to offer a sacrifice if you've got a baby son born. It could be a sacrifice for forgiveness of sins. It could be a sacrifice because God did something great for him. It could be a Thanksgiving sacrifice. It could be a sacrifice for Passover. There's all kinds of things that it could be for. Jesus isn't specific, but he says, so here's this guy coming up. He's going to offer a sacrifice. And then as he's offering the sacrifice, he's there and the priest is there and the priest is about ready to give the sacrifice. The guy says, whoa, wait a minute. I'm sorry, priest, but I just remembered there's this guy and he's got something against me. I need to go take care of that. So he walks away from the sacrifice and walks away from the priest, and then he has to wander through. If it's Passover time, then there's thousands of people in the streets, and he has to find the one particular guy and ask him if everything is okay between them, and then he goes back to the waiting priest and finishes the sacrifice. That's the first story. I like this because Jesus loves exaggeration. He loves to take the most extreme example to make his point. Okay, so that's the first story. Second story that Jesus is telling is a guy, and he's going off to the judge. Now, back in the first century, there weren't too many people who were just judges, and that's who they were. Usually a judge was a king or a ruler or a governor or sometimes a priest or an elder of your village. But it's not usually that. Nowadays we have people who are judges and that's their job and that's what they do. But when Jesus says you're taking it to a judge, it's not just a judge. Usually it's somebody who is not only a judge, but they also have a police force behind them. Okay, I guess that's kind of what it means. So this guy is going up to the judge, and he's saying, well, on the way to the judge, make sure that you haven't done anything to screw up the person who you're opposing, because otherwise the judge may rule against you. He may rule against you, and if he rules against you, and if you owe this guy some money, you're going to go in jail, and you're not coming out of jail until you've paid it, even if you don't have the money. Because back then, that's how jails worked. They didn't have prisons for doing criminal activity. If you did a criminal activity, they would kill you. They didn't put you in jail, they killed you. But if you had a debt, then they would put you in jail. And so Jesus is saying, if you owed this guy something, then the judge will put you in jail instead of you putting him in jail. So you got to take care of these things before you get to court, because it may not go very well for you. Okay. And I want to give a couple examples as well that we're just going to play around with, that we're going to talk about as we discuss these passages. Something that's a little bit more modern. For instance, we can take an accident and insurance. Okay, everybody is supposed to have insurance to get into an accident, and then there gets to be determined if there's somebody at fault, and that person who's at fault, their insurance is the one that covers it. If you don't have insurance, then they're the person who's at fault automatically because they don't have insurance. And so, but there's a situation here where we're looking for somebody who's at fault. Somebody who, if somebody didn't do one thing, then the accident wouldn't have happened. Okay, and that person is then, they're held responsible. Okay, they're the ones who have to deal with it, and we usually let insurance companies deal with these things, but there's always the possibility of dealing with it one-on-one, especially if it's a small accident. Although if it is an accident over a certain amount of money, then you've got to have the police come in and do a report, because that's the law. That's one way of looking at these kinds of situations. Another one is, there is a person that I know, and he ended up doing something that was a kind of a pretty strong level of sexual harassment. The person who he did that to was somebody who had been traumatized traumatized in the past because of sexual harassment, and I mean, was physically and verbally abused by a boyfriend or husband, I'm not sure which, in the past, and and his little sexual harassment in the privacy of her home made her snap, and she went, and he responded to this by getting other people involved and telling people that he was not the one at fault, that she was the one at fault.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem was that it was later found out that actually he had a sexual conviction, and he had broken his probation. And so because he had broken his probation, no matter what happened there, he ended up going into jail for another 6 months, and having more things put on him because so no matter what happened in there, it didn't matter. On the other hand, if he had talked to her, then maybe it wouldn't have gone to court. Mm-hmm. One last example that I want to bring up, and that is, in our country in general, we have a large group of people who in the past, their ancestors were brought here as slaves. And it's, so African Americans, they were brought here as slaves. Turns out that in that same period of time, there were actually millions of people that were also taken as slaves who are Native Americans. This information has just been collected and been published in a book relatively recently.
I just heard that review too.
You heard that on
NPR.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was Hidden Brain.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it was Hidden Brain, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess it was on my podcast.
Okay. Anyway, and so there are these millions of people who, anyway, our nation does not, I mean, they know that they had slaves, but they can't say sorry for it. They don't want to say sorry for it, because if they said sorry for it, then they would have to admit that they did something wrong. And if they admit that they did something wrong, they might have to pay money. And if they paid money, it may be that people would actually sue them for damages. Even though it happened a long time ago, there are some things that are still happening that is a direct result of what had happened a long time ago. So they can't say sorry. So all of these situations, okay, all of these contexts are things that I want to bring about. And what we're talking about today is we're talking about what Jesus calls reconciliation. Reconciliation. So we have all these situations, and reconciliation is at the key to it. So what exactly is reconciliation? Generally, it means the attempt to make things right. It means we screwed up. One of us, somebody screwed up. And reconciliation is basically the recognition saying, I did screw up, and I want to try and make it right with you. You are the person who I messed up or who I hurt, to make it right. Okay, and so this is what Jesus is saying. The very first story that Jesus is saying is he is saying that reconciliation with the person who you wronged is more important than connecting with God. Remember, I talked about the sacrifice, and the sacrifice could be any number of sacrifices. We don't know which sacrifice they're offering, and because of that, Jesus is saying no matter what kind of sacrifice it is more important for them to go and connect with the person who they wronged and try to make it right with them. It is more important to do that than any other kind of sacrifice it is. In other words, what Jesus is saying is that it is more important to get right with your friend. It is more important to ask forgiveness of the person who you wronged than it is to ask forgiveness of God. You ask forgiveness of the person who you hurt first before you ask forgiveness of God. You have to, before you go and worship God or give God respect, you need to go and make right with the person who did that. Before you ask God for a request, you need to go and make it right with the person who you hurt. Before we give God thanks, to remember what it is that he did for us, we have to go and make it right with him. Jesus is saying this is how seriously we have to take reconciliation. Reconciliation comes first before we connect with God. Reconciliation comes first. That is the priority. That is the most important thing. Yeah.
I always, when I read it, I always interpreted it as a command, and as that you wouldn't have much point in giving your gift at the altar because he's not going to receive it. That was the way I read it.
Yeah, we're going to see in a minute it's even more than that.
That you're just like,
Yeah.
you know.
I think that from experience, when there's been something, an enmity between, me and someone else, I kind of can't get to God. It's like there's something in the way, and it's when you get that reconciliation with that person, then that breaks that back open. So it makes a lot of sense. You got to take care of it first, because otherwise you can't even get communication going.
Mm-hmm. No, and that's definitely true that we have to do that. And so yeah, reconciliation is absolutely essential. That God's not gonna. There isn't any communication and all that. It comes down to that whole thing of what Jesus said again. That there are two main commands. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And those two commands are interwoven. It isn't, well, this one first and then the other. They're actually, when Jesus said, and there is one that is like it, what he means is they're kind of the same thing. Mm-hmm. If you're loving God, then you're loving other people. And if you're loving other people, you're loving God. Mm-hmm. And in this sort of thing, if you refuse to love another person, then you are actually not loving God. Even though you can put on all of the semblance of loving God, you can look like a person who's loving God. You can go through all the ritual and everything about loving God, but you're not actually doing it. You're not actually doing it until you work this out with the person who you've wronged. That's the priority. And so, okay. And the reason that Jesus, and I'll tell you, the thing is that we don't like doing this. It is so much easier to ask forgiveness of God than it is to ask forgiveness of somebody else who we wronged. Yeah, I mean, it seems, of course, but
It's actually kind of ridiculous that it's easier to go to God, though, isn't it? I mean, it's because He's God, and that other person's just a person. And
But
yet,
we know-
you're right.
but we know that God is going to forgive us.
Yeah,
You know, God is love, so of course He's going to forgive us. So of course we want to go to God.
yeah.
And he's not, there, you don't have the social situation with
Right.
God.
Yeah.
He's
No,
not-
I
he's
understand
not-
why.
yeah.
But when you really think about it, it's ridiculous because the other person doesn't have the power God has, and yet that's the person we're afraid of. You know, is the other
Mhm.
person.
Not afraid of, I don't think. No, it's embarrassing
Well, it's embarrassing.
to admit that you were wrong.
Oh, it
It's-
is.
It's
It's
a
hard.
power dynamic.
Right.
Right.
It's one downing yourself.
Right.
You don't
Well,
wanna do
I'm
that.
thinking about a situation that I'm
Oh,
realizing.
yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, there's a person that he perceived that I did him wrong, and I paid a penalty too, and have just kind of felt like it was good enough, but I'm kind of realizing it isn't good enough. And then I'm gonna have to go and explain the whole situation to him and apologize because, I mean, I even gave him reason to perceive I did him wrong, but actually it turned out I did, but I didn't intend it to turn out that way,
Right, yeah.
you know?
And then we also need to remember that this is in the context of somebody doing verbal abuse, okay? If any of us, or we know anybody that has done verbal abuse, we all know that that person is not probably going to say sorry for it.
Mm.
It's very hard to do that. It's very hard, not just because it's uncomfortable, but because it makes you vulnerable.
It makes you feel worthless.
The reason that
We
we do verbal
overreact to
abuse or threats or something like that is not just because of a power trip, but because we're trying to protect ourselves.
Mhm.
And we already see ourselves as vulnerable, and we're trying to protect ourselves. And so this language comes out. And what Jesus is saying is, you tried to protect yourself, and and you screwed up, and you ended up hurting another person. And now the response to that is you have to be vulnerable, and you have to open yourself up to them hurting.
Mhm.
That's the answer. And that's very hard to do. That's just extraordinarily hard to do. Why is it again that the United States doesn't want to have to admit that slavery was just wrong officially? Because it makes them vulnerable. It makes them open to being attacked. It makes them open to being hurt. And they don't want to do that.
And having to make reparations.
And having to make reparations. That's right, because that would be the right thing to do.
Right.
But they don't want to have to dig into their already full budget in order to do this.
I mean, they were all promised, 60 acres and a mule or
40
something
acres
like
and a
that.
mule.
40 acres and a mule. Yeah.
40
Hello?
acres and a mule.
Want that 40 acres and a mule. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that would be a beginning. What about keeping all the treaties with the Native Americans?
Yeah.
Where
Too
they
late
have
for
cities, where they have cities now. They've got these cities in certain places. Well, if you're going to do right, you're going to give that land back to the Native Americans who you stole it from.
Mhm. Not gonna happen.
No, it's probably not going to happen. That's the sort of thing. But this is the sort of thing that Jesus is telling us to do. And the problem is that it's easy for us to say on a personal level, well, this is the right thing to do. But it also goes on a national level. There are reconciliation on a national level is opening yourself to vulnerability. That doesn't mean that if you say, well, we were wrong, does it mean that the tribes are going to sue you? That there's going to be people who will sue? Maybe a few. We don't know. But they don't want to take that chance, of course. All right. So, but the other thing that we have to realize is that Jesus is in the first story is talking about a guy and going to sacrifice, and he's basically saying, any kind of relationship you're going to have with God, that's put on hold until you reconcile with the person who you hurt. The other one, the other story, is about two people going to a judge. Who is the judge? God is the judge. God is the judge. So let me read you a passage from Exodus 22, and I've read this before, so you can look it up actually. Exodus 22, and just pass it. Exodus 22, starting at verse starting at verse 21. Exodus 22, starting at verse 21. So the law says, "You shall not wrong any widow or orphan. If you do wrong them and they cry out to me, I will surely listen to their cry. My wrath will flare up, and I will kill you with the sword, and your own wives will be widows, and your children will be orphans." Just keep going. "If you lend money to my people, the poor among you must not be a money lender. You must not demand interest from them. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge," so they're so poor, all they've got left is a cloak, "you shall return it to him before sunset, for this is his only covering. It is the cloak for his body. What else will he sleep in? If he cries out to me, I will listen, for I am compassionate." So what God is saying here is there's these people who have been wronged, and they are crying out to God, and God is listening to him. God's response to this is justice. So if a person is harming a widow or an orphan, God's response is, "You're dead." If I hear this, if you don't make it right, you're dead. Same thing with the guy who takes the cloak as a pledge against the money that this guy owes him. So the guy owes you money, he takes the cloak, but if he doesn't give it to him every night when it's freezing, then God will listen to his cry. Well, we already know what happens when God listens to a poor person's cry. God will kill the other person.
It's pretty intense.
It is really intense. It is intense. And so the thing is that, so now bring that kind of circumstance to Matthew chapter 5. You got two people going to the judge. The judge is God, because two people are going to the altar. What is the altar? The altar is the place of the presence of God. So you get two people going up to the altar, and they are, and one guy wants to see justice done. Well, God has his own determination of justice because he sees all these things. And if you messed up with somebody else and you're bringing him to the judge, it is going to go against you. And so this is the kind of thing, now all of a sudden, we're not just talking about, oh, well, we need to ask God for forgiveness and he'll forgive us because he's such a, no, God could very well kill you. And we say, well, that's Old Testament God. New Testament God isn't going to do that. Well, you know, it's interesting because in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul is saying, you're taking the Lord's Supper not without regard to the body. The body is not the bread. The body is the body of Christ. You are taking the Lord's Supper. You are going to the altar of God without, and you have harmed other people in the body of Christ. You have harmed your brother and sister. And Paul says, this is the reason why some of you are sick and even dead. This is not Old Testament God. This is New Testament God. New Testament God says, if you go to the altar, if you take the Lord's Supper and you have something against your brother, or your brother has something against you, sorry. Your brother has something against you, and then it could turn out badly for you. That's New Testament God. And so, so the thing is that God takes justice very seriously. He takes reconciliation very seriously. though reconciliation makes us vulnerable to the other person, the fact is we are vulnerable already because we screwed up before the eyes of God. And so it's not talking about every single sin that's out there. Here's the thing, is that once again, we're talking about the context of murder. Jesus is saying murder is bad, and then you're going to be punished for verbal abuse or threats or starting a fight with your mouth. And the difference, though, between murder and this other thing is that if you do it verbally, you can still make it right. It's too late if you've murdered. Can't do that anymore. But if all you've done is use your voice, then at least now you can make it right. You can go ahead and follow up and try to do what's right, and you can apologize, or you can make it right now. I like the thing that Jesus all throughout when he talks about reconciliation, he's always very vague. He uses very vague terms. So in one place he talks about you go and make it right. In another place he says the word repent. It's just really vague terms. Well, how are we supposed to reconcile? Well, there's no formula.
No playbook.
Yeah, no playbook for how you reconcile. You go there and you fake it. You just try to do your best. I like the way that Paul says it. He says, be at peace with all men inasmuch as you are able. You can go and you can try and make it right, and that doesn't mean that it's going to be made right. The important thing is that you made the attempt. You made an honest effort to do that. Now, if we are going, so Jesus has a whole system of repentance of what to do if we've screwed up for something. Okay, and I'm gonna summarize it right here. That basically there's four steps to this, and this is different than the steps that we usually think of as the Matthew 18 process, because I'm actually summarizing all of it. So first of all, somebody got hurt, somebody got wronged, it could be verbal abuse, it could be stealing, it could be something else. Somebody got wronged, and that is called sin. Okay. So then the second step, according to Jesus, is that the person who is wrong communicates to the person who sinned and tells them about it. So, and that's part of the Matthew 18 process. We have the same thing with Luke, and Paul mentions the same thing. And the reason why this is so important is because what if the person didn't know that they did anything wrong? And we can say as much as we want, well, of course they did something wrong. They knew how much they hurt me. Maybe, but I have seen people be extraordinarily ignorant on how much they had hurt somebody else. That there were things that they did that of course it hurt them. And just things that people have said that was just really damaging. And they thought that it wasn't a big deal. There's all these people who think, well, that's not a big deal. Well, did you look at their face? Did you see them? Yeah, no, it was really a big deal. You crushed them with your words. And that sometimes happens. So the thing is that for Jesus, part of the process is after something gets done wrong, somebody has to go and say, hey, that really hurt me. That really damaged me. That was bad. That doesn't mean that, anyway, and then after that comes the person who did the sin, the sinner, they have to make it right. That's the general terms, make it right or reconcile. They have to do some sort of reconciliation. They have to try to make it right with the person who they did. And then once they have made the attempt to make it right as best they can, then the person who was wronged originally accepts them back into relationship. None of this, well, I'm okay with you as long as you never see me again. That's not what it's talking about. It's talking about a full acceptance, as long as the person really did do a serious act of reconciliation. That's the process. It's a 4-step process. So there was something something wrong. They got told that they did something wrong, that they tried to reconcile to make it right with the person who they wronged, and then they get forgiven. And forgiven is just that they get accepted back into a relationship. That's the four things. And we often, the thing is that with this process is that we often want to skip a step. Okay, so for instance, there'll be somebody who's really mad at somebody else because they didn't reconcile, but they were also never told that they did anything wrong. Maybe they didn't know. Or they were hoping that the other person didn't notice that they screamed in their face. You know, some people are like that. I know these people. You know these people. Yes. That also we shouldn't go straight to the forgiveness without telling the person how hurt we are. Because that also doesn't, because when we go straight to the forgiveness, what we're doing is we are saying, this is our relationship and it's okay. We can't do that either.
Right.
You know, if we don't feel safe about telling them, I guess we could bring in somebody else and they could tell them, but they gotta know. They gotta know this is not right and this is not gonna go on. On the other hand, we also have to make sure that it was actually something wrong that happened. Because sometimes we get our feelers hurt about something that wasn't necessarily wrong. And that's when we can pull in somebody else. And we ask them, well, you know, I really am hurt by this, and this is a bad thing, and all that. And we need to have somebody else brought in to say, well, you know, was this right or wasn't it? You know, was this a wrong or wasn't it? So we have to have that. So we don't ever want to skip a step. We want to make sure that all four on that. Was it something that was really wrong, or something that was really wrong happened? They were definitely communicated to let know that yes, you did do something wrong and you got to take care of it. That they really tried their best to take care of it, that they didn't just pass it off or whatever. And then finally, the person accepts them because they've gone the extra step to try to make it right. So all four of those are the kind of ideal, best way to happen when something goes wrong. And this is the process that God is actually looking at. That if a wrongdoing happens, this is the process that God wants to see to make sure that everything happened. If the person didn't even know that they did something wrong, God might cut them off. You know, and all that, which is fine, you know, and maybe that's okay. But I'll tell you, I've lived in communities where the norm is, oh, they did something wrong, but we're just going to ignore it.
I think that is really a very common way of behaving.
And I'll tell you, it's lazy.
Yeah.
It's just plain lazy.
It is uncomfortable to have to call somebody on their behavior.
It is uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But it's also, but you know, yeah. And that's how come I think that this whole process is really necessary, because to live in a community where everybody is just ignoring the hurts that's clearly going on is a culture that is that feeds oppression. That means the most vulnerable people are the people who get hurt all the time.
Yeah.
And that's why we end up in a situation where we end up in context, whole church cultures in which women are just abused or hurt all the time. And nothing's being said about it because it's not appropriate for women to talk about it.
And in fact, in that specific kind of a context, which churches and women, they even use this passage against them because they will be told, oh, that was not wrong. You are overreacting.
Right. Women are told that all the time.
Oh yeah, you're overreacting.
We're always overreacting no matter what.
Right. You know, when you have 10 women tell you the same thing is wrong, probably you should be listening to them. Probably.
Yeah.
And so, and this is the problem with patriarchy in general, because if you take any group and you make it a solid group so that way they are not allowed to have any input from any other group, that group is going to be so insular that they don't think that actually anybody thinks any differently than they do. And so we get a group of men together and they are all together and they just like, oh, well, this is the way the world works. And they don't realize that there are people who think totally differently, like they're married to them.
Well, even if they do realize they think totally differently, it's not a valid way of thinking.
Yeah.
There's a family I know where there's 2 males and 7 females, my own.
I know that.
The two males in that family are well aware of our feelings
Yes, I'm sure.
on every subject.
I am sure.
But I think it does, I've always been quick to call people on their offenses. And I'm not saying that in any kind of a proud way for sure, but it's just like, I'm very sensitive, I guess. But it makes me aware that I'm not called. I mean, I know I'm insensitive at times also, and people don't call me on my behavior. And it makes me realize it's a real cultural difference, because in my family, you get called all the time within our group. And especially the guys do. It's especially hard. Anyway.
I really don't feel too sorry for them. On the other hand, I get away with lots of things and I hardly ever get called on it.
Right.
So that shouldn't happen so much.
I want to tell you a story, but I'm gonna wait till we're off the tape.
Okay. All right. But I do want to talk about, I do want to also mention my friend who did an act of sexual harassment, ended up in jail for 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
If right off the bat, he had sought to make right with the person who he hurt, if he had sought that, he wouldn't have ended up going to jail.
Because she wouldn't have called the police.
She would have called the police. And if he had immediately gone and tried to make right, instead of offering excuses, instead of throwing up a smoke screen, instead of saying, it didn't really happen that way, or it's her fault, then it would have been very different.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been very different. He wouldn't have been hurt the way that he was.
Mm-hmm.
He was hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And he has lost his community as well, because it went that way. But the fact is that even up to this day, he does not admit that he did anything wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that's that kind of and I've seen him and other people like that who basically live their lives making excuses or saying, I'm forgiven by God, and that's good enough. Jesus says very clearly, if you haven't actually admitted what you did and tried to make it right with the person you did, you are not forgiven by God. God is not listening to you. And so we've got to be careful, and we have to be careful just in general ways when our African American friends tell us, hey, you're not listening to me. You're not paying that. What you said really hurt me, and you're not listening to me. If we just make off excuses and blow it off, that's on us. We have to listen to them. We have to listen to our friends who have grown up with oppression, just like how so many women have grown up with a certain amount of oppression and they haven't been listened to and haven't been paid attention to. And all of a sudden, a bunch of people are paying attention to them and saying, oh, wow, there is a thing called sexual harassment. It was here the whole time, and it's a big deal. Really? Okay, well, that's nice to hear. Okay, the same thing goes with our African American friends, with our all of our friends of color. It's the same kind of thing. we need to stop and we need to listen and we need to think, hey, did I do something wrong? If I was in their perspective, then maybe I might get hurt by that, and maybe I need to apologize. Because most people don't really want much more than an apology. Some people do. And some people will never forgive you no matter what. But we still need to make the attempt. We need to think about, well, did I do something wrong? If we did, let's admit it and see if we can make it right. And it's not easy, and we haven't always done it. I think it's safe to say that we have situations in which we haven't always done it. And I'm sure my wife will give me a list after we're done.
That's how I roll.
Because that's how you roll, yeah. But let's, this is a very serious subject. This passage makes it extraordinarily serious. But it is also, what we need to remember is that this is God's mercy because it is our way out of judgment. We don't have to live, if we screwed up, we don't have to live under judgment. We can make the attempt to be at peace with people, and then God lets us out of the judgment. It's not like the law. In the law, if you screwed up, you're screwed. There is a law, you break the law, there is a penalty. Under Jesus, you break the law, you try to make things right. And
God forgives you.
And God forgives you. And that's the thing, is that with under Jesus, you don't have to pay the penalty. There are ways around. Okay, and so that's what I had to say. Did anybody have anything to say to that? We're done?